The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet streets of Cedar Ridge when Mary's world came crashing down. She had been the wife of the town's most successful store owner for 8 years, living in the finest house on Main Street with its white picket fence and rose garden that was the envy of every woman in town. Mary had always been careful about her appearance and reputation. She wore the finest dresses, attended church every Sunday, and hosted tea parties for the other wealthy wives. Everyone respected her, and many looked up to her as the perfect example of what a proper woman should be. But beneath all that perfection, Mary felt trapped and lonely. Her husband Richard was 20 years older than her, and spent most of his time at his store or counting money in his study. He rarely spoke to her except to give orders about household matters or to show her off at town events like a prized possession. Their marriage had become cold and empty, more like a business arrangement than a loving partnership. Everything changed when a charming, traveling merchant named William came to town last summer. He was handsome, well-spoken, and most importantly, he actually listened when Mary talked. He made her laugh and feel alive in ways she had forgotten were possible. What started as innocent conversations at the general store slowly turned into secret meetings at the old mill outside of town. For 3 months, Mary lived a double life. During the day, she played the role of the perfect wife, but in the stolen moments with William, she felt like herself again. She knew it was wrong, but she couldn't stop herself. The attention and affection she craved so desperately made her ignore the voice in her head, warning her about the consequences. The affair came to light on a cold October morning when Mrs. Henderson, the town gossip, spotted Mary and William together by the creek. She wasted no time spreading the news, and by noon the entire town knew about Mary's secret. Richard came home early that day, his face red with anger and humiliation. "Pack your things," he said coldly, standing in their bedroom doorway. "You have 1 hour." Mary tried to explain, to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but Richard wouldn't listen. He had already made up his mind. His reputation was everything to him, and Mary had destroyed it with her actions. The whole town was talking, and he couldn't bear the shame of being known as the man whose wife had made a fool of him. Within an hour, Mary found herself standing in the town square with nothing but a small bag of belongings. Richard had called for a public gathering, claiming it was necessary to restore his honor and show the community that he wouldn't tolerate such behavior. The townspeople gathered around, their faces a mixture of curiosity, judgment, and cruel excitement. The ritual that followed was an old tradition that hadn't been used in years. Several women brought buckets of charcoal mixed with water, creating a thick, black paste. Mary was forced to sit on a wooden chair in the center of the square while they smeared the mixture across her face and hands. The black substance was meant to mark her as an adulteress, a visible sign of her shame that would warn others about her character. Children pointed and stared while their mothers pulled them closer, whispering about how this was what happened to women who didn't know their place. The men shook their heads in disapproval, some secretly glad that it wasn't their wives being punished. Throughout it all, Mary sat in silence, tears mixing with the black charcoal on her cheeks. "Let this be a lesson to all," Richard announced to the crowd. "This woman has brought shame upon our family and our community. She is no longer welcome in Cedar Ridge. Anyone who offers her shelter or assistance will answer to me." The crowd began to disperse, but not before each person had gotten a good look at Mary's blackened face. Some spat at the ground near her feet, others simply turned away in disgust. A few of the older women muttered prayers, asking God to forgive such sinful behavior. As the sun began to set, Mary realized that no one was coming to help her. Her former friends avoided eye contact and hurried past as if she carried some terrible disease. The few relatives she had in town had already made it clear that they wanted nothing to do with her. Even the local preacher, who had baptized her as a child, shook his head sadly and told her that she needed to seek redemption elsewhere, with nowhere else to go. Mary picked up her bag and started walking toward the edge of town. Her feet were already sore in her thin shoes, and the black substance on her face was beginning to dry and crack, making her skin feel tight and uncomfortable. She had no money, no food, and no plan for where she would go or how she would survive. The main road stretched out before her, leading away from everything she had ever known. Behind her, the lights of Cedar Ridge began to twinkle as families gathered for dinner and settled in for the evening. She could imagine the conversations happening in those warm, comfortable homes, all centered around her disgrace and what it meant for the town's moral standing. As she walked, Mary thought about William and wondered if he had faced any consequences for their affair. Probably not, she realized bitterly. Men rarely suffered the same punishment as women for such things. He was likely already on his way to the next town, ready to charm another lonely wife with his smooth words and false promises. The night grew colder, and Mary pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. She had never been alone like this before, never had to worry about where her next meal would come from or where she would sleep. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in, and fear crept into her heart alongside the shame and regret. Every step took her further from her old life and deeper into an uncertain future. She had no skills beyond managing a household, no way to earn money, and no respectable family would hire a woman marked as an adulteress. The world beyond Cedar Ridge suddenly seemed vast and terrifying, full of dangers she had never had to face. As the moon rose high above the empty road, Mary continued walking, her feet bleeding inside her shoes and her heart heavy with the weight of her choices. She didn't know where the road would lead her or if she would survive what lay ahead. All she knew was that there was no going back to the life she had lost, and somehow she would have to find a way to build a new one from the ashes of her disgrace. 3 days had passed since Mary left Cedar Ridge, and each step had become more difficult than the last. Her fancy shoes, made for walking on polished floors and church steps, had fallen apart on the rough dirt road. The solace had separated completely, leaving her feet exposed to rocks and thorns. The black charcoal on her face had mostly rubbed off on her sleeve, but dark stains still marked her cheeks and forehead like permanent reminders of her shame. She hadn't eaten anything except wild berries she'd found along the roadside, and even those had made her stomach sick. The water from a muddy stream had helped with her thirst, but it tasted terrible and left her feeling weak. Her fine dress, once the pride of her wardrobe, was now torn and dirty from sleeping on the ground and pushing through bush. The worst part wasn't the physical pain, though. It was the loneliness that felt like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. For the first time in her life, Mary truly understood what it meant to have absolutely no one. No warm bed to return to, no familiar faces to greet her, no routine to follow. Just the endless road stretching ahead and the constant fear of what might happen when darkness fell. On the third evening, as the sun began to set behind the hills, Mary's legs finally gave out. She collapsed beside a large oak tree, her body shaking from exhaustion and hunger. She closed her eyes and wondered if this was how her story would end. Alone and forgotten on some nameless road far from home, the sound of wagon wheels on gravel made her open her eyes. A simple wooden cart was approaching, pulled by 2 tired-looking horses. The man driving wore a worn hat and clothes that had seen better days, but they were clean and mended with care. He appeared to be around 40 years old, with gentle eyes and calloused hands that spoke of hard work and honest living. When he spotted Mary slumped against the tree, he immediately pulled his horses to a stop. Most people who had passed her on the road had either ignored her completely or crossed to the other side to avoid getting too close. This stranger did something different. He climbed down from his wagon and approached her slowly, his face showing concern rather than judgment. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" he asked softly, keeping a respectful distance. His voice carried a kindness that Mary hadn't heard in so long that it almost made her cry. Mary tried to stand but stumbled, her legs too weak to support her weight. The stranger reached out to steady her, and she noticed how gentle his touch was, nothing like the rough hands that had forced her into that chair back in Cedar Ridge. "I'm fine," she whispered, though they both knew it wasn't true. Her voice came out scratchy and weak from thirst and exhaustion. The man studied her face, taking in the fading black stains and the obvious signs of her suffering. Unlike the townspeople who had looked at her with disgust and hatred, his expression remained kind and worried. "When did you last eat something?" he asked, already reaching into his wagon for a cloth-wrapped bundle. I don't remember," Mary admitted, her pride finally crumbling under the weight of her desperation. Without another word, the stranger handed her a piece of bread and a small jug of water. Mary's hands shook as she accepted them, and she had to force herself not to eat too quickly. The bread was simple and plain, but it tasted better than any fancy meal she'd ever had in her former life. "My name is Thomas," the man said, settling down on a nearby rock to give her time to eat. "I own a ranch about 5 miles from here." "Been in town getting supplies?" Mary nodded but didn't offer her own name. She wasn't sure if news of her disgrace had spread this far, and she didn't want to risk losing this man's kindness. Thomas seemed to understand her hesitation. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to," he said quietly. "But you look like someone who's been traveling hard for a while. Where are you headed?" "I don't know," Mary answered honestly. It was the first time she'd spoken the truth about her situation to anyone, and somehow it felt both terrifying and relieving. Thomas nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Sometimes we end up on roads we never planned to travel," he said thoughtfully. "I know something about that myself." As Mary continued eating, Thomas told her a bit about his ranch. He raised cattle and grew enough crops to feed himself and his animals. It was simple work, he explained, but honest and peaceful. He'd built the place with his wife, but she had died 2 years ago during a difficult childbirth, taking their unborn child with her. "Been running the place alone since then," he said, staring off at the horizon. "It's been difficult. Too quiet, if you understand what I mean." Mary did understand. She had felt that same crushing quiet during the long, empty days of her marriage, even when Richard was in the house. Loneliness wasn't just about being alone, it was about being unseen and unheard by the people around you. "The work is more than one person can handle properly," Thomas continued. "I've been thinking about hiring someone to help, but most folks around here have their own families and farms to worry about." He looked at Mary with those kind eyes again. "I don't know what brought you to this road, and I won't ask unless you want to tell me. But if you need a place to stay and don't mind honest work, I could use the help. Nothing inappropriate, you understand. Just cooking, cleaning, maybe helping with the animals. You'd have your own room in the house, and I'd pay you fair wages." Mary stared at him in shock. After 3 days of being treated like something dirty and unwanted, the stranger was offering her not just help, but dignity. Work that would give her purpose and independence. "Why would you help me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't even know me." Thomas was quiet for a moment, looking down at his hands. "After my wife died, I walked around like a dead man for months. Neighbors brought food and offered sympathy, but mostly they just reminded me of what I'd lost. Then one day, an old preacher came by. He didn't try to comfort me or explain God's plan. He just asked if I needed help fixing my broken fence." He smiled sadly at the memory. "We worked together all afternoon, barely said 10 words to each other. But when we finished, I realized I'd gone 4 hours without thinking about my grief. Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is just treat them like a normal person again." Mary felt tears starting to flow, but for the first time in days, they weren't tears of shame or fear. Someone was seeing her as a human being worthy of respect and kindness, not as a symbol of sin and failure. "I accept," she said simply. Thomas smiled and stood up, brushing dust off his pants. "Good, let's get you to the ranch before it gets too dark. Tomorrow you can start fresh, and we'll figure out the rest as we go." As Mary climbed into the wagon beside Thomas, she felt something she hadn't experienced since this whole nightmare began. Hope. Maybe her story wasn't over after all. Maybe this was just the beginning of a different chapter, one where she could rebuild her life with dignity and purpose. The wagon wheels began to turn, carrying her toward an uncertain but promising future. The first morning at Thomas's ranch, Mary woke up in a real bed for the first time in 4 days. The small room he'd given her was simple, but clean, with a window that looked out over rolling hills dotted with cattle. She lay still for a moment, almost afraid to believe that this wasn't just a dream and that she wouldn't wake up beside that oak tree again. When she finally went to the kitchen, she found Thomas already dressed and preparing to head out to check on his animals. He'd left fresh clothes for her on the table, simple work dresses that had belonged to his late wife. They were a bit loose, but clean and practical. "Thought you might want something more suitable for ranch work," he said without making her feel embarrassed about her torn and dirty dress. "Rebecca was about your size. She would have wanted them to be useful again." Mary touched the soft fabric gratefully. "Thank you. I'll take good care of them." "I know you will," Thomas replied, putting on his worn hat. "Take your time settling in today. Tomorrow we can talk about what needs doing around here." But Mary didn't want to wait. She had spent too many years sitting idle in her fancy house, and the thought of being useful again excited her. After Thomas left, she explored the ranch house and quickly saw how much work one person had been trying to handle alone. Dust covered most surfaces, and dirty dishes were piled in the kitchen. Thomas's clothes needed mending, and the floors hadn't been properly cleaned in months. The garden behind the house was overrun with weeds, though she could see the remains of what had once been carefully tended. Vegetable rows. Mary rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She started with the kitchen, scrubbing every dish and surface until they sparkled. Then she moved to the floors, sweeping and mopping until the wooden boards showed their natural grain again. By the time Thomas returned for lunch, the house smelled of soap and fresh air instead of neglect and sadness. "You didn't have to do all this," Thomas said, looking around in amazement. "I wanted to," Mary replied, setting a simple but hot meal on the now clean table. It felt good to be useful again. Thomas sat down and took a bite, then closed his eyes with a look of pure satisfaction. "I'd almost forgotten what a real meal tastes like," he admitted. "Been living mostly on bread and whatever I could heat up quickly." Over the following weeks, Mary threw herself into the work with determination she hadn't known she possessed. She learned to milk the cows, though her hands were clumsy at first and the cows seemed to sense her nervousness. She gathered eggs from chickens that initially terrified her with their sudden movements and loud clucking. She helped Thomas repair broken fence posts, holding boards steady while he hammered nails. The work was harder than anything she'd ever done, but it was also more satisfying. When she successfully baked her first loaf of bread in the ranch kitchen, she felt prouder than she ever had wearing her finest dress to a town social. When she managed to get the vegetable garden cleaned and replanted, watching the first green shoots emerge filled her with joy. Thomas was a patient teacher and a respectful employer. He never made her feel stupid for not knowing how to do something, and he always explained tasks clearly. More importantly, he treated her like a partner in the work rather than just hired help. When she suggested a better way to organize the barn or asked questions about why they did things a certain way, he listened thoughtfully and often implemented her ideas. As autumn turned to winter, their daily routines became comfortable and familiar. Mary would wake before dawn to start breakfast while Thomas went out for the early chores. They'd eat together, planning the day's work over coffee and eggs. During the day, they worked side by side, sharing the load of keeping the ranch running. Evenings were spent by the fire, mending clothes or reading while the wind howled outside. It was during one of those quiet evenings that Mary first heard Thomas really laugh, at something she said about the stubborn old rooster who seemed to think he owned the entire barnyard. The sound was so unexpected and warm that it made her heart skip. She realized she hadn't heard genuine laughter since before her whole world fell apart. The first real test of their partnership came in December when a terrible blizzard struck the area. For 3 days, snow fell so heavily that they couldn't see the barn from the house. The wind was so strong it rattled the windows and threatened to tear the roof off. "We have to get to the cattle," Thomas said on the second morning, looking out at the wall of white. "They'll freeze if we don't get them into the sheltered areas." Mary bundled up in every piece of clothing she could find and followed Thomas out into the storm. The cold hit her like a physical blow, and the wind was so strong she could barely stand upright. They tied a rope between themselves so they wouldn't get separated in the blinding snow. Working together, they managed to guide the frightened cattle into the windbreak areas Thomas had prepared. Mary's fingers went numb despite her gloves, and ice formed on her eyelashes, but she didn't give up. When one young calf got separated from the herd, she crawled through a snowdrift to reach it, carrying it back to safety in her arms. By the time they made it back to the house, both were exhausted and half frozen. Thomas helped Mary out of her wet clothes, his hands gentle and respectful, then wrapped her in blankets by the fire. As feeling returned to her fingers and toes, she realized something important had happened during that storm. She had proven to herself and to Thomas that she was strong enough to handle whatever challenges ranch life could throw at her. "I couldn't have saved those cattle without you," Thomas said quietly as they sat by the fire, sharing hot soup. "You were brave out there." "I was terrified," Mary admitted with a shaky laugh. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," Thomas replied. "It means you do what needs doing anyway." Over the winter months, their conversations grew longer and more personal. Thomas told her about his childhood on his father's farm, about meeting Rebecca at a church social, and about the dreams they'd shared for their ranch. Mary found herself sharing her own stories. Though she was careful to leave out the details of how she'd ended up on that road, Thomas never pressed her for information she wasn't ready to give, but she could sense his curiosity and his growing care for her. Sometimes she caught him watching her as she worked, and the expression on his face made her heart race in ways that both thrilled and frightened her. One evening in late February, as they sat mending harnesses by lamplight, Thomas looked up from his work and said, "Mary, I want you to know that whatever brought you to that road, I'm grateful for it. This place feels alive again with you here." Mary felt tears prick her eyes. "Thomas, there are things about my past that you don't know. Things that might change how you feel about having me here." Thomas set down his tools and looked at her seriously. "We all have chapters in our stories we wish we could rewrite," he said. "What matters to me is the person you are now, the person I see every day working beside me, making this place better with your presence." As spring approached and the snow began to melt, Mary realized that something had grown between them during those long winter months. It wasn't just gratitude or companionship anymore. Thomas had become the best friend she'd ever had, the person she most wanted to share her thoughts and dreams with. And from the way he looked at her, she suspected he might be feeling the same way, but deep in her heart, she knew that their peaceful bubble couldn't last forever. The outside world would intrude eventually, and when it did, she would have to face the consequences of her past and the possibility of losing the happiness she'd found. Spring brought new life to the ranch in ways Mary had never expected. The fields turned green with fresh grass, wildflowers bloomed along the fence lines, and the cattle grew fat and healthy on the rich pasture. But the most surprising change was happening in Mary's own heart. One morning in late April, as she was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, Thomas came up behind her carrying a handful of purple wildflowers he'd picked from the meadow. Without saying a word, he tucked one behind her ear, his fingers gentle against her cheek. "These match your eyes," he said softly, then walked away as if nothing had happened, leaving Mary standing there with her heart pounding and her face burning with a blush. She couldn't hide. Their relationship had been changing slowly over the winter months, but now it felt like everything was rushing towards something neither of them had planned. Their hands would brush when passing tools, and the touch would linger just a moment longer than necessary. During their evening talks by the fire, Thomas would lean closer to hear her voice, and Mary would find herself getting lost in his kind eyes. The moment everything changed came during a thunderstorm in early May. Mary had always been afraid of loud thunder, a fear that went back to her childhood. When lightning struck close to the house one night, she found herself trembling and unable to sleep. Thomas heard her moving around and came to check on her, finding her sitting by the kitchen window, watching the storm with wide, frightened eyes. "Hey, it's all right," he said, sitting down beside her. "The storm will pass soon." Mary tried to smile, but another crack of thunder made her jump and move closer to him instinctively. Thomas put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into his warmth, feeling safer than she had in years. My father used to say that thunder was just God rearranging the furniture in heaven, Thomas whispered, his breath warm against her hair. Mary laughed, despite her fear. That's a nice way to think about it. They sat together until the storm passed, and when Mary finally looked up at Thomas, she saw something in his eyes that took her breath away. Without thinking, she reached up and touched his face, and he leaned down to kiss her so gently that it felt like a question rather than a demand. "Mary," he whispered against her lips, "I think I'm falling in love with you." "I think I already have," she whispered back. And this time, when he kissed her, it felt like coming home for 2 wonderful weeks. They lived in their own private world of newfound love. Thomas would surprise her with small gifts, a pretty stone from the creek or fresh berries he'd found while checking the cattle. Mary would hum while she worked, and Thomas caught himself smiling for no reason other than knowing she was near. They made plans together, talking about expanding the garden, maybe getting some pigs and fixing up the old chicken coop. Thomas even mentioned the possibility of marriage, though they both agreed they should wait a proper amount of time out of respect for his late wife's memory. Their happiness felt too good to be true, and as it turned out, the trouble started. When old Pete Henderson came to buy cattle from Thomas. Pete was Mrs. Henderson's husband, the same woman who had discovered Mary's affair back in Cedar Ridge. Pete had always been a fair man to deal with, but when he saw Mary hanging laundry in the yard, his friendly expression changed to one of shock and disgust. "Thomas," Pete said quietly, pulling him aside near the barn, "do you know who that woman is?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "Her name is Mary, and she works for me." "That's Mary Coleman, the adulteress from Cedar Ridge," Pete said, his voice full of judgment. "They ran her out of town months ago for carrying on with another man behind her husband's back. Had her face painted black and everything." Thomas felt like he'd been punched in the stomach, not because of what Mary had done, but because Pete was looking at him like he'd lost his mind. "What she did before she came here is her business," Thomas said firmly. Pete shook his head. "Thomas, you're a good man, but you're making a mistake. This woman will bring nothing but trouble to your doorstep. Mark my words." After Pete left, Thomas found Mary in the kitchen, and she could tell immediately that something was wrong. Her face went pale when he told her about the conversation. "You know, don't you?" she whispered, sitting down heavily at the table. Thomas sat across from her, reaching for her hands. "I know what Pete told me, but I'd rather hear it from you." With tears streaming down her face, Mary told him everything. About her lonely marriage, about the affair, about the public humiliation and being driven from town. She held nothing back, even though each word felt like it was cutting her heart to pieces. "I understand if you want me to leave," she said when she finished. "I never meant to lie to you. I just thought I was so grateful for your kindness, and I didn't want to lose it." Thomas was quiet for a long time, and Mary prepared herself for the worst. Finally, he squeezed her hands and looked into her eyes. "Mary, what you did was wrong, and I won't pretend otherwise. But people make mistakes, especially when they're hurting and lonely. The woman I've come to love is kind, hardworking, and honest. That's who you are now, and that's what matters to me." Mary felt like she could breathe again, but their relief was short-lived. Word spread quickly through the surrounding communities about the fallen woman living at Thomas's ranch. Some people were merely curious, but others were outraged that a respectable man like Thomas would associate with someone like Mary. The first real confrontation came when Thomas went to town to sell his cattle. The buyers, who had always dealt with him fairly, suddenly offered prices far below what his animals were worth. "Sorry, Thomas," said Joe Miller, the livestock dealer, "but people are talking about your situation at home. Some folks don't want to do business with a man who keeps that kind of company." Thomas's face turned red with anger. "My personal life has nothing to do with the quality of my cattle." "Maybe not," Joe shrugged, "but business is business. People have standards, you know." Thomas had to sell his cattle for half their value, which meant he'd barely have enough money to buy supplies for the summer. When he came home and told Mary what had happened, she felt sick with guilt. "This is all my fault," she said, tears flowing again. "I'm ruining your life just like I ruined Richard's." "No," Thomas said firmly, pulling her into his arms. "You Didn't ruin Richard's life? He cared more about his reputation than his wife. I care more about you than what small-minded people think. But the pressure kept building. Letters arrived from Thomas's few remaining relatives, begging him to reconsider his association with Mary. The local preacher paid a visit, speaking about the importance of moral standards in the community. Even some of Thomas's hired hands quit, saying they couldn't work for a man who lived in sin. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Mary made a decision that broke her heart but felt necessary. "Thomas," she said quietly, "I think I should leave." He turned to look at her, his eyes full of pain. "Is that what you want?" "No," she whispered, "but I can't keep watching you lose everything because of me. You deserve better than this." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the land he'd worked so hard to build. Mary could see the struggle in his face, the battle between his love for her and his practical need to survive in this community. "Let me think about it," he said finally, and Mary's heart sank because she knew that meant he was already considering letting her go. That night, she lay awake planning her departure, trying to figure out where she could go and how she could start over again. But she also held on to a tiny hope that Thomas would fight for their love, that he would choose her over the easier path of giving in to social pressure. Mary woke up before dawn on what she had decided would be her last morning at the ranch. She had packed her few belongings in the same small bag she'd arrived with, leaving behind the dresses Thomas had given her. They'd belonged to his wife's memory, and she had no right to take them. As she moved quietly through the kitchen, preparing one final breakfast for Thomas, her heart felt like it was breaking all over again. She memorized every detail of the room where she'd found so much happiness. The wooden table where they'd shared countless meals and conversations, the window that looked out over the rolling hills, the chair by the fireplace where Thomas would sit reading while she mended clothes. She was just placing fresh biscuits in the oven when she heard Thomas's footsteps behind her. He stopped in the doorway, and she knew without turning around that he had seen her packed bag sitting by the door. "You're really leaving," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Mary kept her back turned, afraid that if she looked at him, she would lose her resolve. "It's for the best. You know it is? The best for who?" Thomas asked, moving closer. "For the people who judge us? For your ex-husband who cares more about his reputation than anything else? Or for us? For you," Mary whispered, finally turning to face him. "I can't watch you lose everything you've worked for because of my mistakes." Thomas looked terrible, like he hadn't slept all night. His hair was messy, and his eyes were red with exhaustion and pain. "What if I don't want you to make that choice for me?" Mary felt tears starting, but she forced herself to stay strong. "Thomas, be practical. The whole community is turning against you. You can't sell your cattle. People won't do business with you, and it's only going to get worse. I won't let you sacrifice your entire life for me." "And what about your life?" Thomas asked, his voice rising with frustration. "Where will you go? How will you survive? Do you think I can just watch you? Walk away and pretend to be happy?" Before Mary could answer, they heard the sound of multiple horses approaching the house. Through the window, they could see a group of men riding up the path. Mary's heart sank when she recognized Richard, her former husband, leading the group. "They've come for me?" she said quietly. Her face going pale, Thomas grabbed his rifle from above the fireplace and checked to make sure it was loaded. "They'll have to go through me first." The group of men dismounted and approached the house. Besides Richard, Mary recognized several prominent men from Cedar Ridge, including the mayor and 2 wealthy store owners. They looked angry and determined. Richard stepped forward and called out, "Thomas Harrison, we need to talk." Thomas opened the door but stood firmly in the doorway, his rifle visible but not threatening. "What do you want, Richard?" "I want that woman removed from decent society," Richard said coldly, pointing at Mary. "She's a destructive influence, and now she's corrupting you too." "My personal affairs are none of your business," Thomas replied calmly. "They are when they affect the moral standards of our entire region," the mayor interjected. "Thomas, you're a respected man, but harboring an adulteress is bringing shame on all of us." Mary stepped up beside Thomas, her chin raised despite her fear. "I'll go with you," she said. "Just leave Thomas alone." "No," Thomas said firmly, putting his arm around her. "You're not going anywhere." Richard's face twisted with rage. "She's poisoned your mind, just like she poisoned our marriage. Can't you see what she is?" "I see a woman who made a mistake and has spent every day since trying to make up for it," Thomas said. "I see someone who works harder than anyone I know, who's kind to animals and honest in her dealings. What I don't see is any reason why her past should determine her future." "Her past is who she is," Richard spat. "Once an adulteress, always an adulteress. She'd do the same thing to you eventually." Thomas took a step forward, his eyes blazing with anger. "Don't you dare speak about her like that. Mary is twice the person you ever were. At least she feels remorse for her actions. When did you ever show her the love and attention a wife deserves?" The accusation hit Richard like a slap. Several of the other men shifted uncomfortably, perhaps remembering their own failings as husbands. "That's not the point," the mayor said quickly. "The point is that the community has standards and we can't allow them to be compromised." "Whose standards?" Thomas asked. "The same community that turns its back on people when they need help the most? The same people who'd rather destroy someone than offer forgiveness?" An older man named Frank, who owned the largest farm in the area, spoke up. "Thomas, I've known you since you were a boy. You're a good man, but you're making a mistake. This woman will bring you nothing but trouble. She's brought me more happiness than I've known since my wife died," Thomas said simply. "She's made me remember what it feels like to have a partner, someone who shares the work and the dreams. If that's trouble, then I'll take it." Mary looked at Thomas in amazement. She had expected him to eventually give in to the pressure, but instead he was fighting for her with a passion that took her breath away. "I won't change my mind," Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger. "Mary has earned her place here through honest work and genuine care. If you can't accept that, then you're not the kind of people I want to associate with anyway." Richard laughed bitterly. "You'll regret this, Thomas. When she runs off with the next smooth-talking stranger who comes along, don't come crying to us. That will never happen," Mary said, finding her voice at last. She stepped forward, looking directly at Richard. "I loved you once, Richard, but you never saw me as anything more than a decoration for your successful life. Thomas sees me as a real person, with flaws and strengths. He knows my worst mistakes, and he still chooses to stand beside me. That's, something you never understood." Richard's face went red with rage, but before he could respond, Frank held up his hand. "This has gone far enough," the older man said. "Thomas, you're a grown man, and you have the right to make your own choices. I don't agree with them, but I respect your right to make them." Several of the other men nodded, looking uncomfortable with the confrontation. It was clear that not everyone in the group was as determined as Richard to destroy Thomas and Mary's happiness. "Fine," Richard said through gritted teeth. "But don't expect any support from the community. You'll be outcast, both of you." "We'll manage," Thomas said calmly. As the group rode away, Mary collapsed into Thomas's arms, overwhelmed by relief and love. "I can't believe you did that," she whispered. "You risked everything for me." "I didn't risk anything," Thomas said, holding her tight. "I chose what mattered most. I chose love over fear, hope over hate." Over the following months, some members of the community did shun them, but others gradually came to accept their relationship. Frank proved to be an unexpected ally, offering to buy Thomas's cattle at fair prices and encouraging other reasonable people to judge them by their actions rather than their past. Thomas and Mary were married in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with only Frank and his wife as witnesses. It wasn't the grand wedding Mary had dreamed of as a young girl, but it was perfect because it was built on genuine love and mutual respect. Their first child was born the following spring, a healthy baby girl who brought joy and laughter back to the ranch house. As Mary rocked her daughter to sleep in the same room where she had once planned her escape, she marveled at how much her life had changed. She had learned that true love wasn't about avoiding mistakes, but about finding someone Who would stand beside you while you worked to become better? Thomas had shown her that redemption was possible, that the past didn't have to define the future, and that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with the darkest chapters, looking out at the sunset over their land, with their baby sleeping peacefully and Thomas working in the fields. Mary knew she had finally found where she belonged.